The single biggest difference in the stock market of our day versus Graham's time is Graham was obsessed with book value, with the asset value of companies.
Right.
And today, increasingly, it's intangibles
Yes,
that
exactly.
contribute
Intellectual property and
exactly.
Right.
Where corporate value really comes from today is things like patents, trademarks, technology, all the forms of intellectual property and other intangibles. And Graham was obsessed with tangible asset value and felt that intangible asset value was sort of an illusion, which I think in his day it really was.
It was.
Today, of course, it's not. I mean, for a company like Amazon or Apple or Google or any number of other giant technology companies we could name, the value is in, what's in their employees' heads. It's in their patents, their trademarks, the unique platforms that they set up using their technology. So you'd be crazy not to factor those into the value of a company, even though that's not really a part of Graham's basic framework. Where you get into trouble is when you extrapolate using those intangibles at rates that aren't realistic. And that's where Graham's method of thinking can be so helpful. I mean, if you find yourself saying, I think this can grow at 50 or 100% a year for the next 30 years, the same way it has for the last 30, then you need a reality check, and that's what Graham is great for.
Your point is that Warren Buffett basically looked at value investing and the margin of safety that you have, so that if you do have a market pullback, that the company has some cushion financially, that it can survive a market rout, whatever. But he took it, and I'm wondering if it was for his purposes of companies that he wanted to invest in, buy higher quality companies at reasonable prices. So he's really stretched the definition, right, of value investing to include a much broader group of companies.
Yeah, that's
correct.
Is that fair? So I think it's important for investors to realize that the margin of safety sort of exists on two different strata, two layers. So there's a margin of safety that you want to have in your investments themselves. You want to make sure that if you feel a company is worth $100 a share, that you're not paying $120, because then you have a negative margin of safety. You want to try to pay 80 or 60 if you can. You
Right.
certainly don't want to pay more than 100. But there's another place the margin of safety needs to exist, which is in your portfolio as a whole. You don't want to risk more than you can afford to lose. And if you're too aggressive in your stance toward the market, you can get wiped out just when the sensible thing to do would be to be buying more. So you need to have the margin of safety at both levels, within your companies and within your portfolio. So it's partly a method for valuing companies, and it's also an attitude for how you conduct yourself as an investor, for how you
Right.
diversify and how you hold. But Buffett has definitely used it as a method of buying companies that Graham probably, at least in his prime, wouldn't have considered.
And how do you think Benjamin Graham would view index funds and the fact that we own index funds and we're not applying any sort of valuation to them, except that we should just hold them because the stock market goes up most of the time?
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of people, a lot of traditional value investors are under the impression that index funds would have been anathema to Graham, that he would have hated them. But in fact, that's completely wrong. Graham was among the first people ever to advocate for index funds, starting in the 1950s. And in 1963, he gave a speech where he said, somebody should somebody should develop this idea. You know, it
Right.
should be possible just to buy all the stocks he used the Dow. You know, you should be able to buy all the stocks in the Dow in one basket, and just own that, and
Right.
that would be appropriate for a lot of people. Graham liked index funds. He was around long enough to see the advent of the first institutional index funds in 1971, and he was asked about the idea, and he said he approved of it. You know, they're the perfect solution for the kind of investor Graham called defensive. If you're a
Yes.
defensive investor and you don't want to spend a lot of time and effort analyzing individual securities, then an index fund is the perfect portfolio tool for you.
What advice would Graham give to investors today in the current market environment, which is quite frothy and speculative?
I think what Graham would say is, you know, you need to know what game you're playing. And once you identify what the game is that you're playing, you should play that game. And don't try to play other people's games. If you think you can trade speculatively, and that's your game, then I guess you should go ahead. But if you are a long-term investor, you know, in my opinion, you have no business trading short-term or making speculative gambles. That's somebody else's game, and they might get rich doing it, at least in the short run, but that doesn't make you poor. I mean, their gain is not your loss. Furthermore, let's see how they're doing a year from now or 5 years from now, because chances are their gains they won't still have those gains by then.
We will certainly see what happens exactly in the markets, especially given the current levels. So, Jason, thanks so much for joining us and explaining why Benjamin Graham is still as relevant today as he was when he first published The Intelligent Investor.
Yep, my pleasure, Consuelo. Thanks for having me.